Ouais, ça va.
Front regiments from Hanover and Brunswick, Bavaria and Württemberg, Hesse and the Piedmont, Holland, Belgium, Prussia and Russia, Austria and the English.
700,000 of them, only 200,000 of us.
700,000 once they have joined together. We must attack them separately and fight the Prussian army under Blücher and the English army under Wellington before they can combine forces. I hand the Prussians over to you, Grouchy.
Thank you, sire.
And the English to you, Ney.
With pleasure, sire.
June 18th, 1815. 4 hours into the Battle of Waterloo, two vast armies are locked in mortal combat. On one side, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France.
Napoleon, as a commander and a strategist, was one of the greatest commanders in history.
On the other side, an Allied army under the future Duke of Wellington.
Wellington was the natural man to lead the united forces of the Allies against Napoleon.
At stake, all of Europe. At 4 p.m., 12,000 French horsemen thunder toward the British line in one of the greatest cavalry charges in history.
Form squares! Form squares!
The Allies quickly form British infantry squares.
The squares were lines and lines of bayonets.
But are they enough to survive this massive charge?
Wellington was looking for the back door. He knew his army had just about had it.
The result of this clash will determine the course of the battle and the future of Europe. Can the Allies save themselves and the continent from Napoleon Bonaparte? Ten years earlier, in 1805, Napoleon had begun expanding the French Empire, winning battle after battle, marching undefeated until he controlled nearly all of Western Europe. But his attempt to conquer Russia failed. While he defeated the Russian army, he couldn't defeat the Russian winter. By 1814, the Allied forces captured Napoleon, restored the French monarchy, and exiled the fallen emperor to Elba, a tiny Mediterranean island. The Allied nations of Europe believed that Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer a threat. They were mistaken. In Brussels, an Englishman by the name of Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, arrives to command an Allied army that was quickly convened to drive Napoleon from power. As a commander, Wellington is markedly different from Napoleon.
Wellington was autocratic, aristocratic, not a warm and fuzzy type of soldier.
He did not like the underclass troops that he had to have. He called them scum.
And he didn't think they were an effective fighting force.
We have a very weak army, totally ill-equipped, with a very weak staff.
However, his tactics were fantastic, and he was very careful of his men, which caused them to respect him.
Napoleon, on the other hand, had a great deal of respect for his troops. They, in turn, were intensely loyal to him.
Dying men would scream, "Vive l'Empereur!" as he would come by.
But their biggest difference is in their approach to battle.
Napoleon was the absolute master of the offense, the attack, was meeting the absolute master of the defense, Wellington.
Allied with the British is Prussia, the leading kingdom of the German Empire. The Prussian army is under the command of the elderly Field Marshal, Count Gebhard von Blücher.
Blücher was 72 years old by the time of Waterloo. An old man, yet still full of passion, a womanizer, a drinker. He loved life, and more than anything else, he loved killing Frenchmen.
Herr General, ein Brief.
Ich habe keine Zeit für Schriftverkehr.
Aber, Herr General, ist von Napoleon selbst. Hat Friedensverhandlungen angeboten.
Napoleon sent peace offers to his former enemies, without results.
Napoleon ist eine Bedrohung. Hat uns beim letzten Mal besiegt. Und vielleicht siegt wieder, aber wir werden niemals aufgeben. Niemals!
The last thing in the world Napoleon wants to do in 1815 is go to war. He's not ready.
The Allies declared war on him, so he did not create the war. The war came to him.
Left, left, right.
In June 1815, Wellington and Blücher assemble their troops for battle. Blücher, with over 125,000 Prussian troops, is just to the east of Brussels. Wellington, near the Belgian coast, has a force of British and Dutch troops that number a little over 100,000. the two armies prepared to link up and march on to Paris in an overwhelming show of force. Napoleon is backed into a corner.
He knows that up in Brussels, he's got Wellington and his armies. The Prussians are nearby.
His notion is that the best defense is a quick and decisive offense.
Napoleon chose to go on the offensive, to cross the border from France into Belgium and attack.
Napoleon moves quickly to ensure that Wellington and Blücher have no time to join forces. He leads his army of 130,000 north to take on each Allied army one at a time.
Napoleon would concentrate all or most of his combat power against an element of the enemy force, destroy it, and then reconcentrate that combat power against another element of the enemy force and destroy that until he had actually broken the enemy's will to continue to fight.
In his first military action since exile, Napoleon's strategy to divide and conquer works like magic. On June 16, 1815, his advanced troops isolate and attack a much smaller Prussian force. The Prussians quickly fall before the larger French force.
Mon général, nous avons vaincu les Prussiens. Ils battent en retraite.
Bien, parfait. Maintenant, allons nous occuper des Anglais.
The Prussians are seen in full retreat, and Napoleon believes he's already won half the battle. He orders 1/3 of his army to continue following the fleeing Prussian troops. It is the morning of June 18, 1815. Napoleon has brought his newly rebuilt army to the fields of Belgium. To face the outnumbered English and Dutch army of the Duke of Wellington. And when the day is over, the future of Europe will be changed forever. Napoleon's army is on the move. They cross the border toward Brussels and attack the Prussian army, led by Field Marshal Blücher, and force them into retreat. Napoleon is now marching toward the British Allies, led by the future Duke of Wellington.
Wellington, who was primarily a defensive master, looked at the ground and he said, since Napoleon is on the offensive, where do I want to defend?
Wellington chooses a battleground just to the south of a village called Waterloo.
The battlefield of Waterloo was basically a wide valley running from west to east. To the north stands the Allied army. Looking directly at them, you have the French army, a massive army.
The position that Wellington chose to accept battle from Napoleon was behind a ridge line, and that allowed him protection from direct fire from artillery, from direct observation.
His biggest advantage, he picked the battlefield. He knew the ground, and he knew how he would defend it.
Wellington expects a full French assault at dawn, but to his surprise, it doesn't come.
He has 30,000 more troops than we do. They're all veterans.
And he's a direct line of supply. Yet he does nothing.
Il est presque 10 heures. Le sol est si boueux que l'artillerie ne peut pas se déplacer.
It had been raining for days. That, of course, limited the mobility of cavalry and the ability of cavalry horses to pull guns into position. So the battlefield favored the defender. In other words, Napoleon had a problem.
If Napoleon waits for the ground to dry out, his army may fight more effectively, but it may also give the fleeing Prussians time to circle back and join Wellington.
Peut-être devriez-vous donner l'ordre d'attaque?
Je donnerai l'ordre quand je jugerai que c'est le bon moment. Jusque-là, nous attendons.
Armchair generals have argued for decades about Napoleon's decision to begin the battle late in the day. While some believe the muddy ground was the main issue, not everyone agrees.
Napoleon certainly does seem to have grown more weak and lethargic in his later days. He had no real combat experience recently. Some argue that he just lost the edge.
But there is evidence of a more compelling reason for the emperor's delay: illness.
He had pituitary problems, he had hemorrhoids, he had stomach problems that were not very well diagnosed. He was vomiting throughout the night, and how much sleep he even got is really in question.
Napoleon's ill health was kept secret from everyone until nearly 100 years after Waterloo, when documents revealed the serious condition of his health. Rather than fighting a battle to save his empire on that morning, Napoleon should probably have been in a hospital.
If you want to get an idea what it was like for Napoleon to be on the battlefield of Waterloo, you have to envision that you have had an entire box of laxative. You have then ridden 20 miles and stayed up all night. And now somebody says, you have to command a war game. What condition are you in?
With Napoleon refusing to give orders and the sun already high, Marshal Ney begins to take command of the French army on his own. His first order is an assault on the walled chateau called Hougoumont. Wellington's defensive line stood on a ridge at Waterloo. But in front of the line stood two fortified buildings, Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte. These were key elements in Wellington's defensive strategy against Napoleon. Troops and sharpshooters in the walled chateaus would prevent the French army from a simple advance over open ground.
He considered them to be breakwaters, if you will, so that when the waves of French forces came against him, they would be forced to hit Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte.
The strategic importance of the two farmhouses was that they prevented the French army from simply advancing over open ground.
It would divide up the force of the attack coming forward, splitting up the troops into channels that you can then bombard with artillery.
Under Ney's orders, 4 regiments of infantry marched toward Hougoumont. If they can capture it, the left side of the British line will be undefended and open to attack. Inside the chateau are a handful of men from the Coldstream Guards, an elite British regiment. At 10 a.m., the French attack. The fighting at Hougoumont is fierce, but by 11:30 that morning, the British repel the first assault and prepare for a siege.
Well done, men.
The first shots have been fired. At Waterloo, the battle is underway. Despite the Allied success at Hougoumont, Wellington knows he'll need the support of the Prussians to beat Napoleon.
Are we certain that the Prussians are going to come?
As certain as one can be of anything in war, which is certain of nothing at all. Perhaps the French defeated them yesterday, and that's why there's no rush to attack.
But the wrath of Napoleon has just begun. Soon the Allies will get a taste of his most powerful weapon. Blood is about to be spilled on the fields of Waterloo. A French attack on the chateau called Hougoumont, ordered by Marshal Ney, has failed. But it has signaled the start of the Battle of Waterloo.
C'est quoi ce coup de feu? Qui les a tirés?
Une escarmouche, Votre Altesse.
Où ça?
Sur notre gauche, le château. Je crois que nous progressons.
Ah oui. Ça a commencé.
Votre Altesse, est-ce que...
Oui, commencez. Faites goûter les Anglais nos canons de 12. Allez-y.
Hold that line, lads.
At noon, the French artillery opens up on the British lines.
Hold the line, lads!
80 cannons, firing 12-pound solid shot, rip through the British lines. But Wellington does not allow the British to fire back. He will save his cannon shot for when the French infantry and cavalry approach his lines.
The ricochet effect was one of the great things about the solid shot. Even on its third bounce, it was still doing devastating effects. It could still break a leg or an ankle.
Hard pounding, gentlemen.
Indeed, sir.
Well, we will see who can pound the longest.
20 kilometers away, Blücher and the Prussians are regrouping after being beaten by the French the day before. But rather than retreat east back to Prussia, the wily general heads north.
Wir müssen mit Wellington in der Verbindung bleiben.
Herr General, ist es dir ist.
Man schreit zum Ton der Kanonen.
It is estimated that over 500 men were killed in this opening salvo of the battle. Then, at approximately 1 o'clock, Napoleon's guns stopped. With the British troops reeling from the artillery assault, Napoleon quickly assesses the situation and plans the best way to attack the soldiers on the ridge.
Attaque directe au centre. C'est la clé de la victoire.
The strategy of marching directly toward your opponent over open ground may seem ludicrous today. But the firearm technology of the period demanded close-quarter combat. The most commonly used firearm at Waterloo was the musket. A soldier aiming his musket at another man 100 meters away has about a 1 in 30 chance of hitting him. If his target is 50 meters away, his chances improve to 1 in 3. Napoleon's direct thrust up the Allied center is intended to break Wellington's army in half and cause it to collapse.
He clearly thought a good, solid assault would break their will to resist and lead them into a rout. Remember that Napoleon never really encountered the British before himself, and he tended to underestimate their resolve and their determination to hold their ground.
The French advanced on the English line in column formation. Each French column consists of a block of men, 150 across, 24 deep, approximately 3,600 altogether. The sheer numbers of this approaching mass was meant to intimidate and terrify an enemy. The alternative to the French column formation was the British line. Essentially a long row of men, 2, sometimes 3 deep.
The line formation gives one major advantage over any other. You can bring all your guns to bear.
In a column, only the first 2 rows of soldiers can safely shoot their guns. In a line, every soldier can shoot, giving them a tremendous advantage in firepower. At 2 p.m., the British line awaits the advancing columns of Napoleon.
He was just going to punch straight up the middle, whereas normally he won his battles through maneuvering on the flanks. This time, he just wanted to go straight up that road and flatten anything that stood in front of him. And he believed he could.
At the top of the ridge, the French column meets the English line, with devastating results. British line, with its superior firepower, stops the advancing column in its tracks.
Hold your line! Fire!
When you had the right kind of soldier with the right kind of training and the right kind of spirit, the line could hold out against a column, break its charge to the point where it lost its effectiveness.
The French troops could not proceed any further. The British countercharge, with the support of the cavalry, forces Napoleon's troops back to their lines.
Well, sir, we brought the battle right to Bonaparte.
You act as if the battle is over, Uxbridge. Yet all I see is 2 brigades of horses destroyed and thousands of men dead. And our lines exactly where they were this morning.
The first frontal assault at Waterloo has left thousands of casualties, with nothing gained.
Nous sommes où? L'infanterie?
Nous sommes de retour.
De retour? Pourquoi de retour? Pourquoi? Le centre est la clé, Ney. Wellington est prêt à craquer. Nous, on n'est même pas capable de maintenir le centre. Cette ferme est à nous.
Napoleon realizes that he can't control the battlefield without first taking La Haye-Sainte.
Non, Votre Altesse.
Mais alors, prenez-la, à n'importe quel prix. Je veux pas vous revoir que lorsque le centre est hors de nos mains.
The Battle of Waterloo has been underway for 3 hours. The British line has held, but Wellington knows that nothing has been decided. The battle lines remain completely unchanged, and thousands lie dead. But the battle is about to turn.
Die Franzosen! Die Franzosen!
June 18th, 1815. Napoleon Bonaparte now stands poised to once again dominate Europe. His strategy is to take control of the center of the battlefield with a direct attack on the British position at La Haye-Sainte.
The most important salient was the one close to Wellington's center, and that was La Haye-Sainte.
It was vital that the French had to get this before they could attack the center, which was their first objective of the battle.
The walled farmhouse is defended by the King's German Legion. They were Germans who had fled to England when Napoleon conquered their country in 1805. They have a lot to fight for. If Napoleon is defeated, they can return home. Whoever holds the farmhouse will have control over the all-important center of the battlefield. At 3 p.m., Napoleon orders 2 full brigades of infantry, 2,000 men, to take the farmhouse at all costs. Facing the Frenchmen are only 450 riflemen. The outnumbered soldiers do have one big advantage: superior firepower. This unit of the British Army carried rifles, not muskets. The rifled grooves inside the barrel spin the bullet, like a quarterback throwing a football, giving it greater range and superior accuracy. At approximately 3:20 p.m., 7 hours into the Battle of Waterloo, 2,000 French soldiers charged the small fortress.
Die Franzosen! Die Franzosen! Die Franzosen kommen! Die Franzosen kommen! Mach schneller! Attacke! Attacke!
Each time the walls are about to be breached, the outnumbered Allied riflemen somehow hold off the French. Near 4 p.m., the French sound a retreat. Over 400 of Napoleon's soldiers lay dead. The Allied troops suffered heavy casualties too. But they still held their ground.
It always requires more men to take and capture such a position than it does to hold it. The British training was hold until relieved, and if you didn't get relieved, you died in your spot, but you didn't abandon it.
During the assault on the walled chateau, the French artillery pounded the British front lines. The carnage from cannon fire was so great, Wellington ordered his troops to fall back behind the ridge overlooking the battle.
It appeared to Ney that the British were retreating.
What they were doing was just seeking some refuge behind the hill. So Ney was convinced that victory was his, destroy the fleeing British, and the day was theirs.
Standard operating procedure at the time was, if the enemy's retreating, release your cavalry.
Now, at approximately 4 p.m., Marshal Ney orders the French cavalry to assemble. In an incredible display of power, 12,000 French cavalrymen charged the British position. At 200 yards, canister shot from British guns tears into the French horsemen. The British infantry is about to face one of the largest cavalry charges in history. But they have a defense in place. The British formed infantry squares, a formation designed specifically to defend against a cavalry attack. At 4 p.m., the squares are put to the ultimate test.
The squares were perfect defense against cavalry. Lines and lines of bayonets, hedgerows of bayonets as they're described.
An infantry square is based on simple animal psychology. A horse will not run into a row of pointed bayonets. Unable to break through the squares, Ney orders his cavalry to retreat, then orders them to charge again. Each time the cavalry fell back, the French cannons bombarded the British squares until the cavalry could charge again.
Those squares became killing grounds for the French artillery.
Good God.
They slowly filled up with their own wounded and dead.
Again and again, the French charge was repeated. And again, the British squares wavered, but held.
The squares were steady and firm, and they held against all these waves of French assault. But they paid a terrible price for this. Enough that Wellington was looking for the back door. He knew his army had just about had it.
Unable to break through the British squares, the French cavalry charge is called off. Both sides suffer massive casualties.
I believe we have pushed them back, sir.
No, Uxbridge. We're at the breaking point. We cannot take another charge. If we're to survive, either Knight or the Prussians must come.
By 5 in the afternoon, the Battle of Waterloo is at a virtual stalemate. A massive charge by the French cavalry ordered by Michel Ney had left heavy casualties on both sides. Napoleon knew that Ney's move had been a near fatal blunder.
Wellington est prêt à craquer, Votre Excellence. Plus qu'un seul attaque pour le finir.
Un seul attaque, mais avec quoi? Vous avez détruit ma cavalerie. Vous avez détruit mon armée.
Ney was the bravest of the brave. He was not necessarily the smartest of the smart. and he was not necessarily the sort of commander that you'd give that sort of operational control to.
He was undoubtedly courageous. He had a very good eye for tactics. He had very little insight strategically.
Despite the setbacks, Napoleon still believes that victory can be his.
There were some battles he had fought in the past where he was very close to losing, but he had snatched victory from the jaws of defeat.
Napoleon still believes that the key to victory is to control the center of the battlefield. Yet again, he orders his troops to attack La Haye-Sainte. At approximately 6:15 p.m., they march toward the fortress. Earlier in the battle, the Allied riflemen had successfully held off the French infantry. But now, they had a problem. They were rapidly running out of ammunition.
Wellington knew the importance of holding that. Unfortunately, they found it impossible to resupply them because of their forward position in the Allied lines.
If La Haye-Sainte had fallen some 2-3 hours earlier, Wellington would have called it a day and pulled out.
Within minutes, over 2,000 French soldiers overwhelmed the Allied stronghold. Defeat comes quickly for Wellington's men.
They fought to the last round, until in the early evening, Bering had no choice but to abandon the position by running through the farmhouse and fighting their way through to their own lines on the ridge behind them. Out of the 400 men, 42 got out.
That's a 90% casualty rate. But these brave Germans held the center of the battlefield for almost the entire day. This stalled Napoleon's all-out attack on Wellington's main lines on the ridge. But now, the French control La Haye-Sainte.
We have lost the farmhouse, Uxbridge, and we are next. Send out riders to find Blucher. Tell him the battle is lost unless he arrives immediately. Immediately.
As evening approaches, an army is sighted marching toward the battleground. Napoleon hopes that it is his returning French troops who had pursued the Prussians. Wellington hopes that the unidentified troops are the Prussians. The identity of the distant troops may well determine who is the victor at Waterloo.
Bitte?
What is it?
Where is the Duke?
Are you Prussian?
Ja, Herr Blücher has brought the army.
Good fortune has just lent Wellington a hand.
The Prussians arrived at the battle exactly where Wellington needed them. They advanced en masse. It's exactly what Wellington needed.
For Napoleon, the news is devastating. But he decides to tell his men the approaching troops are French.
Dites aux hommes que le maréchal Grouchy n'est plus loin et qu'il vient nous aider maintenant.
Mais, Votre Altesse, ce n'est pas
Oui,
possible.
je sais. On ne peut pas nous permettre de faire laisser tomber le moral maintenant. De plus, nous avons toujours la garde.
The Old Guard were the elite units of the French army. To even be considered as a member of the Old Guard, you had to be a veteran. They were the type of troop who would fight at the command every time. They would not retreat, they would not fall.
Napoleon still saw that he had a chance to succeed, still thinking that maybe only one Prussian corps was coming his way. He could hold them off and then complete the destruction of the British.
If Napoleon can act quickly, he may be able to destroy Wellington's army before the Prussians arrive. At this point, he still has superior numbers and the Guard. If anyone were to break through Wellington's wavering line, it would be them. Napoleon orders 4,500 of his finest soldiers to march straight up to the British lines.
20 years of fighting, they had never been defeated. He committed those soldiers to the front to attack again into the British right center.
And now, Wellington gives a surprising order. He tells a large number of his troops to lie down behind the ridge. The British load their cannons with double loads of canister shot.
Canister shot. It's a canister filled with balls, and it's used against close-range targets. It is essentially a shotgun round.
As the Old Guard march toward the ridge, they get a taste of British artillery.
Feuer!
But the Guard does not waver. A column of French infantry stretching over 500 yards approaches the thin line of soldiers on the British ridge. As they near the crest of the hill, the firing begins. The first line of British soldiers is easily defeated. Napoleon thinks he has gained an easy victory, but Wellington is about to pull a surprise that will turn the tide of battle and change the future of a continent. Napoleon has ordered his most elite fighting force, the Old Guard, to take the British ridge. But Wellington has a surprise for the French. He has hidden most of his British troops behind the crest of a hill. The Battle of Waterloo is about to crescendo. The Guard have never retreated. They have never been defeated. As they approach the British line, the first shots are exchanged. Napoleon's crack fighting units easily defeat the first line of British troops. The Guard sense an easy victory as they reach the crest of the hill. Then, Wellington pulls his biggest surprise.
Now, maidens.
1,400 British infantrymen stand up at once. The surprise is devastating. 20% of the French troops fall on the very first British volley.
Then at the crucial moment, the command was given by Wellington. With the raising of his hat, he ordered his entire army to advance, bayonets forward.
For king and country!
Though many of the Guard hold their ground, many others do something they had never done before. They turn and run.
The word began to run up and down the ranks. La garde recule, the Guard is retreating.
Soon, most of the army follows. Within minutes, Napoleon's entire force is in retreat.
All morale was broken. That was the end for them.
Votre Excellence! Votre Excellence!
Donnez l'ordre à l'artillerie de commencer le bombardement.
Mon général, mais...
Dites-le leur! Dites-le leur!
To cover his own escape, Napoleon orders his artillery to begin firing, even though the barrage will cut down his own retreating troops. It was a shocking decision from a man the French army was devoted to, the final brutal military act of a once great leader.
Où allons-nous, Votre Excellence?
À Paris. Et puis, seul le bon Dieu le sait.
After 9 brutal hours, victory finally belongs to the Allies, but at a terrible cost. By By the end of June 18, 1815, 40,000 men and 10,000 horses lay wounded or dead, and an empire is lost forever.
If there is a lesson to be learned from the Battle of Waterloo, for the commander, it is that you must know and understand your enemy.
And don't fight until you're absolutely ready to fight.
Marshal Michel Ney was arrested by the newly restored French monarchy. He was charged with treason for betraying the king and executed by firing squad. Blücher retired after Waterloo, living another 4 years with the distinct pleasure of knowing he had ended the career of his hated enemy. Wellington became one of the most popular and powerful men in Britain, using his victory at Waterloo to eventually become the Prime Minister of England. Napoleon surrendered himself into the hands of the British authorities. He asked for sanctuary, hoping to live as a private gentleman, as a guest of the British people. Instead, the Allies exiled Napoleon to the most remote island in the Atlantic, St. Helena. Once the undisputed ruler of the greatest empire in the world, he would spend the last few years of his life as the emperor of nothing, a lonely man stranded on a desolate rock in the middle of nowhere.
Napoleon fought and won more battles than Alexander the Great, Frederick the Great, Hannibal, and Caesar combined. And yet, we know him for Waterloo. What a tragedy.
Waterloo was the last major decisive battle involving all of Europe until we get to World War I.
But on June 18, 1815, no one knew this bloody battlefield would lead to a century of peace and prosperity for the entire continent. That night, Field Marshal Blücher and the Duke of Wellington met at the very inn where Napoleon had made his headquarters. Blücher spoke no English and knew only one phrase in French.
Quelle affaire!
On June 18, 1815, an entire continent was changed. The European empire of Napoleon Bonaparte had been decisively crushed, and a single battle forever became a metaphor for final defeat. A battleground called Waterloo.